I'm indifferent.
I don't believe in God.
To the existence of
God is not judging them.
I don't have proof.
I don't know how to pray.
They're judging themselves.
Where is God in all of this? This is my home.
God exists.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything.
I don't pray.
Only to God.
If there was a God,
And I thought,
I just have this understanding that life is hard.
he could never love me after this.
God is still good.
Hey there, Maybe God family. We are so glad that you're joining us today. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe wherever you're watching or listening today so that you can easily find all of our weekly content that's aimed at helping hopeful skeptics and doubtful believers ask better questions about God. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming in our studio for the very first time, all the way from across the pond in the UK, author and podcast host, Justin Brierley. Now, for 17 years, he hosted conversations between Christians and non-Christians on The Unbelievable Show. And if you've been watching Maybe God for the past several months, you know that Justin has been guest hosting some really fascinating conversations for us. I know from the feedback that we've gotten from all of you that you've been really inspired and challenged by the stories that he has shared with our community, and we are so grateful. Justin is here today to talk about his brand new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So I just want to welcome to Houston, Texas for the first time today, Justin Brierley.
Wow, what an introduction, Eric.
We try.
I'm so pleased to be here because I've obviously been, talking to you for several months now, guest hosting some podcasts for you guys, but all from the UK. So it's lovely to be here in the heart of it.
It's nice to not have to take the time difference into consideration when we meet.
Or all the technical issues that occur when you're trying to do things remotely. But,
right. Yeah. And you brought your son, Noah.
I did.
Here, and y'all are having a great time. Had your first breakfast taco this morning.
Exactly. So we are getting all of the Houston experiences that
I'm just telling you, be careful, because Houston gets its grip on you and suddenly you're a Texan and can't ever leave.
Oh, no, we love it. I did come here back in 2009, actually. So it's not my very first time in Houston. But Noah, who came with us, was only 4 years old. He's now this hulking 18-year-old.
He is. He's
taller
a
than
giant.
Me. He's probably as tall as you.
Yeah,
right?
he's huge.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So tell us a little bit about what life's been like for you, Justin, since most people probably know you still from the Unbelievable years, and life's different now and wonderful, and you're doing amazing things like this book. Just tell us what you've been up to.
It's been a really interesting moment of transition for me. So obviously saying goodbye, a very bittersweet goodbye to the Unbelievable Show after 17 and a half years of hosting it. But what a privilege to have all of those conversations in the archive. So many interesting people that I was able to meet and discuss with. But it's really, I feel, all been leading up to me being able to, I guess, broaden my ministry, hopefully, of engaging the non-Christian and Christian world and bringing more of these conversations on faith to people. And that's what I'm hoping to do with this new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's drawing on a lot of those conversations from the last several years and just showing why I think the atmosphere is changing, actually, when it comes to the God conversation.
Yeah. Well, that whole topic is so interesting, and I hope we can get into it today so that everybody can kind of be brought up to speed about how the conversation has changed and why that matters. But maybe let's talk a little bit more about your experience on Unbelievable and what you learned over the years. I mean, I've shared with you before that I learned how to interview people by watching you, because when we started Maybe God, I had no idea how to interview people. I thought I was supposed to just fight with people. And my producers and team was like, you can't do that anymore, Eric. We want people to listen. And so they told me to watch you, and you taught me a lot. What did you learn over the years about how to have fruitful conversations?
I guess I learned that, yes, you need to listen as much as you need to bring a defense or, answers to people's questions. But it is important to make sure that people feel like they are genuinely being heard, because otherwise it's not a conversation. Also, that being confident in your faith is as much about being able to hear an alternative perspective without having a knee-jerk response of fear or flight. And for me, that's really important, actually, because we live in a very post-Christian culture in many ways now. We have to be able to have good conversations. And what the show was able to do, I think, was model those for many people. You wouldn't necessarily feel like, the Christian won every time by any means. It was very much whatever happened when the mics were open happened, But actually, I think over the years, even the non-Christians, the many non-Christians who listened to the show, they gained a respect for Christianity because they saw people engaging fruitfully, civilly, and they may not have agreed with everything they heard, but actually it was a good example of how to have good conversations.
It really was. And, I know the show goes on and life goes on, but I don't want to be, too sad about it, but I miss it already. Do you miss it?
I miss it. And look, I'm sure that in due course, I will be returning to hosting those kinds of dialogues. I feel like it is, a gifting that God's given me. And I've heard many other people say it, especially since I've left the show, oh, I'd love to see you in that format again. I'm sure it will come round again. For now, I'm really enjoying it, kind of almost a sabbatical, really, from that, pursuing some new projects. I've got a new podcast documentary that's coming out soon based on this new book, and co-hosting another podcast based in London called Re-enchanting, which is really about talking through some of these conversations with interesting people, looking at re-enchanting the secular world with the Christian worldview. So it's that rich tapestry of what happens in life, but I'm sure the conversations will be back before too long.
That's great. We need them. And I've always thought it's interesting that we don't have something like that show stateside. And, I know that part of your approach, as you've said, is just listening. And what that entails is giving every worldview and every person the benefit of the doubt and trying to hear the best version of the argument that they're making, right? And you were always so gifted at that and so patient. And to the extent that sometimes on your show, I thought, well, the Christian lost that, if it was a fight and the scorecard was, it didn't always shake out in the Christian's favor. And you would tend to, let that happen without needing to be subjective or biased. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why in America on Christian radio stations, there's not as much of an openness.
I think there might be something to that. I think that inevitably the show was sort of experimental even in the UK. And because it had that open-ended format, it wasn't just pat answers and apologetics. It did mean that it was a little bit more out there, a little bit more dangerous in a sense. But I think that's actually why it succeeded in the end, because actually people felt like they were really listening to something genuine, not a kind of scripted kind of outcome. And for that reason, that's why I think it ultimately did have a very diverse audience, both Christians and non-Christians listening. They felt like, no, we're really being genuinely heard and understood here.
Yeah.
And for me, whether or not, on any specific occasion, a Christian or atheist felt like they won the day, the point was that in the longer run, I think it did something good for both sides. As I say, it helped them to understand each other. I don't think if someone listened, as a non-Christian for a year, 2 years, maybe 10 years or more, that some of those folks have been listening, they could walk away saying, well, Christianity is just fairy tales and nonsense. They will have heard something resembling a good intellectual case for Christianity from all kinds of different perspectives and angles. And for me, that was in a sense part of the importance of the show. And I know people for whom over many years it took however long for them to actually come to the point where actually they were willing to ultimately change their mind.
Yeah. Well, before I was a Christian, I used to say things and hear things like, arguing with a Christian is like playing chess with a pigeon. Have you seen that meme?
Yeah, I have.
No matter how good you are at playing chess, and no matter how much you win the argument, the pigeon's just going to knock the pieces over and strut around like you won. And I think that's the impression we give a lot of times as Christians, and that's what the world expects of us. And your show for 17 plus years was sort of the counter to that narrative. And I think that's why it was so valuable. And this is not intended, this conversation is much more than a retrospective and a looking back. I just want to talk about that part of your life as the precursor to what is happening now. Because now maybe it's even more important than it was before that we have better conversations, right?
Yeah.
And everything that you've learned over the years, I think kind of went into this book and goes into everything that you talk about in interviews like this one.
Absolutely. For me, when the show began all those years ago, we were living in a pre-social media world. And I couldn't have realized just how much more polarized things would become in that world. Yeah. So we need these kinds of conversations that actually bring people together.
That's right. So let's talk about this book you've written, which I bought the online the ebook, which is the book is just fantastic. It's beautifully written. It's what I love about books. The first thing I look at are the footnotes or endnotes and the bibliography, because that tells me a lot about what went into the writing and just the thorough research you did for this book, pulling from your own conversations and experiences, but also from, just academia and the research that's out there. Just really well done.
Thank you.
I want to say. Tell us what went into the idea in its inception to write this book.
I think the book really started to formulate in my mind around the time I was hosting the Unbelievable show, but realizing that the conversations were changing. So the show began in the heyday of New Atheism, and a lot of the conversations that I was hosting represented that kind of combative form of atheism, represented by figures like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, coming on to debate Christian thinkers. That sort of was the bread and butter, really, of the show for several years. And then I noticed a sort of change in the atmosphere of the conversations. Increasingly, guests who were coming on as atheists were distancing themselves from this new atheist movement. They were saying, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. And I was also experiencing a lot more sort of secular thinkers, but with much more nuanced understanding of Christianity. They weren't dismissing it out of hand. They understood the value of the Christian story. And as some of those conversations started to predominate, I thought, well, maybe something's changing in the atmosphere here. And for me, that was the first sort of clue that actually maybe there was something happening. The new atheism seemed to be fading away, a new conversation coming in its place. And in the end, I kind of, this and a number of other factors led me to believe that actually I think there's a sea change happening. Somewhere upstream, something's happening in our culture. We may not be feeling it because obviously the statistics still tell us that, church attendance is declining, that more and more people say they're non-religious. But nonetheless, I still felt something was changing somewhere.
Yeah. Well, and obviously New Atheism forms part of the foundation of the book. I mean, that to understand the book and where you're coming from, you really kind of have to be familiar with what is meant by the term New Atheism. The subtitle for the book is Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. But I would say most people probably don't know what to think when they hear the phrase New Atheism. It's been a few years since that was, making headlines in Time magazine or wherever they were writing about New Atheism. And yet we know the thinking behind New Atheism shaped a lot of what people assume to be true about the world and religion and science and things. And so let's talk about New Atheism. Sure. When did that phrase arise, and who are the sort of forerunners in the movement?
I believe the phrase New Atheism was coined by a journalist in 2006, Gary Wolfe, in an article where he was profiling some of these characters who were making headlines at the time: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. These were the so-called four horsemen of New Atheism. What was it? It was a very dogmatic form of atheism, one that was very much in the culture, in the media. It wasn't just sort of sheltered in ivory towers in academia. And these were people who said not only was it irrational to believe in God, but that religion was dangerous for you.
Yeah.
So it was fueled by 9/11 and concerns about fundamentalist religion from that, also by cultural concerns around the teaching of creationism in classrooms and so on. So there was a bit of a movement, and I think, again, fueled by the internet coming of age,
right,
and the fact that lots of disparate people who were non-religious could now gather together in online communities.
Sure.
And it was this movement that just sort of, I guess, a perfect storm of factors came together, and we called it the New Atheism. Probably the most nearest, the nearest thing to an advertising campaign it had in the UK was the Atheist Bus campaign. So these were London buses circulating the capital, bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So that was really interesting to see effectively atheism advertising itself. That really hadn't happened before in the UK. And perhaps here in the US, a similar high watermark was the Reason Rally in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Tens of thousands of agnostics and skeptics coming out to sort of champion science and reason. So it was a very interesting cultural moment.
Yeah, this would have been, early 2000s primarily?
Yeah, mid-2000s through to, I would say, about the mid-2010s.
I think part of it I agree with everything you said, but another factor, at least in the States, was I think it was in part a response to the moral majority kind of Christian right political movement. And,
I'd agree.
Bushism was kind of the tail end of that, at least W. Bush. And, this sort of America as a Christian nation sort of thing. And 9/11 and then the wars that most or many people disagreed with at the time, and everyone disagrees with now in retrospect, Iraq and Afghanistan, being sort of phrased or couched as semi-holy wars. Like these are, this is return. George W. Bush used the word crusade a lot during that time. And I think this was also part of a reaction against that sort of cultural reality.
I think it was. And to that extent, I think the real driver for the new atheism was more located in the US ultimately than the UK, where we don't have a kind of Christian moral majority, religious right wing in that sense. And so I think it was a lot of secularists and atheists who felt that they sort of had to defend their corner and they had to speak up for secularization and the church and state separation and so on. So a lot of that was driving it, and you had your own billboard campaigns, and probably still do to some extent, from secular organizations trying to make sure that Christians don't impinge on schools and so on. So yes, that was a lot of what was driving it. As I say, it felt like it was a very strong and quite well-known movement for a number of years. But it did ultimately tail off in the end. Sure.
It did, as a predominant sort of force that led a lot of people into its influence. I think it still has ripple effects, though, to this day. I still pick up on the sort of rhetoric of the new atheists that I recall. It was complicated for me in the 2000s because I wasn't really a Christian yet in terms of being someone all in with Jesus. And I was in the church, but I was, as I've told you before, kind of a liberal political activist person. And a lot of what the new atheist leaders were saying is stuff that I had been saying from within the church. Other than, except for like just God is a delusion, a lot of the social implications of it I'd already been talking about. So I was like a little bit torn as far as my allegiances. When did you start to pick up on the foundation crumbling underneath new atheism?
I think there were a few different things. I think there were forces from outside the movement that led to it ultimately running out of steam. So I think the fact in the end that it didn't really deliver a positive ethic for life, people couldn't actually form a kind of a basis for living purely on science and reason. So once they'd torn down God, if you like, they didn't erect anything in God's place for people to kind of find helpful and meaningful in their life. So I think that was partly why it failed. It simply didn't deliver. But in the end, internally, there was also really a kind of unraveling that took place. And this was fascinating to watch from the sidelines, because in some ways, I think the culture wars came early for new atheism. There was one particular moment in 2011 called that's been dubbed Elevator Gate, where a skeptical vlogger called Rebecca Watson, who goes online as Skeptic, was giving a talk at an atheist conference. These have become quite popular. She was alongside people like Richard Dawkins, and she was talking about the problem of sexism and misogyny in the atheist movement. That night, going back to her room at about 4 a.m. after drinks with some of the other speakers, she got propositioned in the elevator by one of the delegates at this conference. And she later vlogged about this and said, this is the problem, folks, with the atheist movement. Now, that might have been the end of it, except that Richard Dawkins himself, really the leader of the movement, then blogged in response to her vlog, a highly sarcastic response titled Dear Muslima, where he compared her concerns with, say, women in, very religiously oppressive societies, and said, forget about, having your hands chopped off. Think of your poor sisters being asked to coffee in a room. And this just poured gasoline on the whole debate. So suddenly the whole thing exploded, with people on one side saying, no, atheism has to be more than just a denial of God. It has to be pro-feminism, LGBT rights, equality issues, and so on. And they were that turned into something that came to be dubbed atheism plus. So it's atheism plus a commitment to these kind of social justice issues. But then there was a big backlash against that. And so people who were more on the kind of the Dawkins side, who said, no, we just want science and free thinking.
Materialism, strict materialism.
We don't need any of these politically correct ideologies in our movement. And they, if you like, ended up going in the what you might call anti-woke direction. But what happened there was the movement basically split into two camps. And from then on, there were just increasing numbers of controversies within the movement, leaders falling out with each other over that and other issues, people who simply refused to share a stage any longer at some of these atheist conferences, to the point where some of the chief architects of the movement, later wrote that they highly regretted ever being part of it because
Is that right?
because they didn't like the direction it went. So it was interesting to watch that, and I think that because the movement itself started to splinter and fragment in this way, obviously that meant it couldn't really continue the energy it had before.
Yeah, so interesting. And people that missed the boat on this movement and might not know exactly how influential it was. There was a time when, for young intellectuals in the West, I mean, the writings of Dawkins and the talks of Christopher Hitchens and Dennett and Sam Harris.
Yeah.
I mean, it was taken as gospel truth.
And it was cool to be an atheist.
Oh, it was really
it
cool.
was like, it felt like a kind of really intellectually savvy, trendy thing.
Yeah.
But one example that I talk about in the book where things, I think I got a clue that something had flipped quite dramatically was in 2018, I was due to come over to the US to host an onstage debate between an atheist and a Christian. And I reached out to an atheist I'd had on the show only 4 or 5 years before, Peter BOGHOSSIan. And he was really a poster boy of the new atheist, really.
Sure.
A philosophy tutor at Portland State University. He'd written a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, which was exactly what it says on the tin. It was about arguing people out of what he believed were their religious delusions.
Right.
He even compared, being a person of faith to being sort of deluded, to a mental illness, effectively. Yeah. So that was, you can kind of see where he stood on the issue in that way. But when I contacted him, as I say, about 4 or 5 years later for this conversation, I was bowled over by the email I received in response. He said, Justin, I'm really not debating religious issues with religious people anymore. In fact, I regard a lot of Christians and people of faith as being more my allies now than my foes.
Amazing.
And I was like, and he said, you'll find out why, but I believe there's a far more pernicious enemy that we need to be fighting. And what that transpired to be was effectively what he calls grievance studies. These are kind of academic studies centered on issues around race, LGBT, feminism, and other things, where he believed that a certain sort of politically correct ideology was capturing academia, an orthodoxy that couldn't be questioned, and was actually creating this kind of cancel culture on campus, and sort of academic freedom of expression was being squashed. So he and his co-conspirators developed all of these hoax papers that they managed to get published in peer-reviewed journals, basically just parroting the right kind of language and so on. And when this was exposed, it caused quite the controversy in academic circles. But it was so interesting, regardless of what you think about his views and those politics and stuff, that he flipped from kind of debating and being very anti-religious to actually seeing people of faith and some Christians as his allies. And the way in which the whole ground shifted, because the culture wars were changing everyone's allegiances at that point. And yes, he's certainly not a convert to Christianity by any stretch of the imagination, but he certainly realized, I think, at that point, it turns out that Christians and fundamentalists of that kind are the least of my worries. It was this new kind of what he would see quasi-religious stuff in his own backyard in academia. That was the thing he suddenly realized he needed to work on. So just in the book, I just try and detail the way some of these sort of frontiers have changed over time.
Yeah, the BOGHOSSIan, James Lindsay,
and Helen
Pluckrose. They were the trio that put those false papers together and submitted them to journals. And a lot of those submissions were accepted into those journals and lauded in some cases. One of them was, I think, if I'm remembering this right, was just a word-for-word translation of Mein Kampf.
Yeah, it was dressed up sections of Mein Kampf, and they managed to, which I think, does highlight that there are concerns around what is being taken as sort of, makes sense in academia these days. I mean, I'm not saying that I, in a sense, endorse everything that BOGHOSSIan and others say and do, because they've kind of very much gone all in on the culture wars. But what was interesting is that wherever you look now at the new atheists, none of their leaders are critiquing institutional religion any longer. They've all taken sides on the culture wars. So as I say, some went in a very progressive direction. Others like BOGHOSSIan and to an extent Richard Dawkins now have gone in a very anti-woke direction. And that's been the thing that has really captured all their time and attention. They're not talking about religion anymore.
Okay, Maybe God listeners, we're going to take a little break now to let you know about something brand new that we're doing on this podcast. If you're a longtime listener, you know we've never aired ads or asked our listeners to pay for any content. But ever since we committed to producing weekly content on the podcast and on our YouTube channel, Maybe God has reached the point at which sponsorships are necessary to keep growing. We don't intend to simply sell out to the highest bidders, however. What we'd like to do instead is to invite you, our Maybe God family, to feature some of the exciting things you've got going on in your lives. Whether it's your business, your favorite charity, or some other project that you really want our listeners to know about. With that in mind and in that spirit, I'm excited to introduce to you our very first Maybe God sponsor today. Now, this person also happens to be one of our most loyal listeners, and when he agreed to sponsor this episode, he asked us to promote his residential and commercial real estate firm. But I'm more interested in telling you about the man behind the business. I've known Josh Hill, along with his wife and kids, for over 2 years now, and all I can say about him is that he's a man of his word. If he says he'll be there, he'll be there. If he commits to doing something, he'll get it done, no matter how busy he happens to be and no matter how many other irons in the fire he's got to handle. Josh always shows up, and he shows up with a warm heart and a big smile on his face. I think that's how he and his partner Terrence Barnes have managed to build one of Houston's most respected real estate firms. Their company is called HTX Group, and with over 35 years of experience serving the greater Houston area, Josh and Terrence and their team pride themselves on making every client feel like they're the only client. I know from experience that finding a place to live in this city can seem impossible, if not overwhelming, but the team over at HTX Group can help you find the perfect place to call home. I recommend them all the time to my friends and church members, and so I want to recommend them to you. Whether you're a first-time home buyer, a growing family, or an empty nester, I hope you'll contact the HTX Group today by visiting htxgroup.com or by calling 713-628-7956. And when you reach out to them, be sure to tell them that you heard about the HTX Group while listening to the Maybe God podcast. I think a lot of people looking sort of from the outside in at the culture war would say, well, it's Christians and religious people that are concerned about woke versus unwoke stuff. You know, I would be just fine if I never heard another Christian podcast or a sermon about woke stuff. And if I felt like I didn't have to talk about it anymore, that'd be great. But you have this whole subsection of society now of academia and intellectual atheists or former atheists that are deeply concerned about this.
And I think the reason they're concerned is because they've realized that you can't just get rid of religion in that sense. That I think what they rather naively assumed, I think, the new atheists, that once they had sort of demolished God and got rid of that story, people would sort of be open to science and reason and critical thinking, and it would all just be a sort of logical utopia. Of course, that wasn't what emerged. They didn't actually have that many converts, I think, to this sort of scientific rationalism. What they cleared the way for, I think, is the coming in of a lot of quasi-religious stories, because people, in my view, still need a kind of religious story to live by. We're meaning-seeking creatures. None of us can really live believing that we're just bouncing around chaotically in a meaningless universe. And so people tend to, in the absence of the Christian story, import other quasi-religious stories. And I think some of these, on the left, some of those progressive woke ideologies serve that kind of function for people. They're sort of, that's their sacred thing, that's their identity, that's the thing that, you know. But equally on the right, you get political mythologies, you know.
Nationalistic.
There's a certain, you know, savior of America that's being lauded by certain people at the moment. And,
I have no idea what you're talking about. Let's move on.
And so it's a kind of, but it exists on both sides, basically, that the religious instinct doesn't go away, even in the absence of the Christian story.
It's almost like people are people, regardless of, you know, where exactly. Because what you're describing, the downfall of new atheism sounds a lot like what's happening with certain denominations in Christendom right now. And it's just so fascinating to think about. What do you think specifically folks that you're describing, the Boghossians of the world, what specifically did they realize is lost when God is lost?
I think they realize potentially that objective truth is potentially lost, because if we can basically invent our own truth, then it's very difficult to have a conversation with people in the end. So I think that's one of the things they're missing in a sense. I think at least they realized that when they were kind of confronting Christians, there was still a kind of specific truth on the table to be debated. Does God exist or not? Is there a meaning to life or not? Now I think in a more kind of postmodern kind of world that they're often having these conversations, truth is all relative. It's person specific. And so, you know, you're not allowed to question someone else's truth, if you like, because it's seen as insulting or derogatory. And so I think that's one of the issues that they're dealing with. I think they're also just coming to realize that you can't, as I say, get rid of that religious instinct. I think they've kind of realized that it was almost a pointless exercise trying to squash that, and you actually have to work alongside it. So it's interesting hearing even Richard Dawkins in some of his most recent podcasts and things, not sort of just accepting actually that maybe Christianity wasn't so bad. Maybe, you know, if we have to have a story to live by, it's better than some of the stories that exist out there.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating when you hear even someone who was as hardline as him mellowing in that kind of way.
What was it that he said to his followers? At one point, he said publicly, you know, go after the Christians, like humiliate them, ridicule them in public. Like, he was very militant. In his rhetoric, at least.
He was, but I just wonder whether the reason he's toned some of that rhetoric down in recent years is because he's been on the receiving end of some of that, as he has then ceased to be flavour of the month among certain liberal circles because of, say, his views on transgender. Right. He has suddenly received an awful lot of ridicule, pillorying, and a backlash. So I just wonder whether he's realised, what was good for the goose is good for the gander. There's this, you know, he's seen the other side of it.
Yeah. Well, you know, that brings to mind other stories you hear in the news. J.K. Rowling, for example, who was the hero of, I don't even say the left, it's the cultural hero, you know, of entire generations. And you know, when she says, well, you know, a woman is a woman and a man is a man, or whatever it was she said, you know, not denigrating or dehumanizing anyone in any capacity, but she didn't follow the narrative. So she was, you know, basically the victim of a witch hunt at that point.
And became a social pariah in certain circles. And this is the interesting thing about the culture we live in, where, as I say, when you have someone who is a sort of cultural icon, like J.K. Rowling, can suddenly be seen by some parts of culture as this, you know, person who's essentially a bigot and a transphobe and everything. It does show just how quickly the culture has moved on in that way. I think the question for me is how much longer we can sustain this kind of culture war, basically, because I think ultimately what we're starting to see is the signs that culture is kind of cracking under it, because we can't sustain all of these different stories that are so ultimately different to each other, where your truth does not, you know, directly confronts my truth. And so how are we going to work this out? We've lost the ability, as we were saying earlier, to have good conversations, unfortunately. So what I'm noticing is that as people jettisoned the Christian story, which gave people ultimately a shared narrative, a kind of communal sense of who they were, why they were here in the world, what their identity was, as that's been replaced by a million different stories about who you are and what your identity is that are all competing with each other, it's creating this very fractured, polarized culture. And so the question is, how much longer can we sort of continue with the benefits that the Christian story gave us when we're telling so many alternative stories to the Christian story now? And that's interesting because I've noticed other intellectuals, secular intellectuals, noticing the same thing, saying, hey, it turns out we've got a meaning crisis on our hands. It turns out that in the absence of the Christian story, people really don't know why they're here or what they're here for. And that's part of the book is sort of saying, okay, the new atheism failed. It kind of cleared the way for lots of these quasi-religious stories to come in, but those stories aren't working. Yeah. And suddenly you've got the rise of interesting people asking significant questions about whether we can live without something that does help us to live together like the Christian story did.
Yeah. It brings to mind what you shared in the book about Tom Holland. Could you just talk to us about Tom Holland and his journey?
Absolutely. Tom Holland's a fascinating individual. I always
Not
have to
Spider-Man.
say. Not Spider-Man.
Right.
Not that Tom Holland. This is another English Tom Holland who has actually got a fascinating story himself, which he tells in his best-selling book Dominion, of having grown up with something of a sort of nominal Anglican faith as a child, but it sputtered out by his teenage years. And he was a happy sort of secular intellectual, researching as an adult the world of the ancient Greeks and Romans. He published some really best-selling historical works on that. But as he entered that world and started to understand it more and more, he realized how very alien the values and the culture were to his own. So this was a world where slavery was just an accepted part of the economic fabric, where the treatment of women and children was very different to our culture. You could expose children you didn't want. That meant literally leaving them for the wild animals. That was just an accepted part of the way you treated children. Likewise, people could be sexual property. The slaughter and enslavement of 1 million people would be a cause of celebration for Caesar. And he realized as he looked at this world that it was so different to his own values of freedom, equality, dignity. And he asked, where did those values come from? They didn't obviously come from the world of the Greeks and the Romans. And he knew they didn't come from science and the Enlightenment either. He realized where they came from was Jesus Christ. The Christian revolution was what shaped and gave us our moral instincts in the West. And he tells this over about the course of about 3,000 or 4,000 pages. But his own sort of revelation has led him to really start to talk about that in secular circles. He's been challenging a lot of his humanist peers who say, well, you know, we don't need Christianity to be good people and so on. And just reminding them, well, actually, you are a Christian. I mean, you may not believe the stories, but actually everything you hold dear came from this story. And that's been really interesting when you have a secular intellectual like Tom Holland basically saying, the Christian story is actually what gave us the culture that we enjoy here. And I've had the privilege of having him in conversation with various people on that subject. So he's just one of the people where I find there's this, as I say, surprising rebirth of belief in God. It's someone who, by all accounts, should be, you know, an atheist and a secularist, but who recognizes the value of the Christian story and is actually rather worried about what will replace it as we start to lose that.
What specifically of worth is he referring to when he says that, you know, everything that makes our Western civilization what it is comes from, everything important comes from the Christian, you know, perspective? Is he talking about the inherent implicit worth of every human being, like the Imago Dei? Is that? Absolutely.
He would say, if you like, that Judaism was obviously the first place where you found that idea of the inherent worth of every person because they're made in the image of God. But that Christianity sent that global, effectively. It took that idea, and not only did it preach it in every corner of the world, it also embodied it in the story of Jesus Christ. Because there you had this, what was obviously in pagan times, a bizarre, strange story of a God who apparently, according to his followers, became human and then died the death of a rebellious slave on a cross. This was not the way you constructed your God stories in the ancient world. And yet this idea of a God who sacrifices himself for the poor, for the vulnerable, that power sacrifices itself for the weak, that became the driving force of the Christian story. And that was so countercultural to the world it came out of, and yet it transformed the world that it went into. And for Tom Holland, for him, every time that someone in the Western world does something like an act of charity for someone else, you know, the fact that we create welfare systems for the most vulnerable people, he says, this is not a result of Greek, you know, democratic thinking. This is not a result of Enlightenment thinking. This is a Christian theological belief that you're putting into practice. And we've forgotten, effectively, that everything we believe in that respect is a very bizarre, culturally contingent thing that came directly from Christianity. But he's saying, he's just trying to remind people that the water they swim in is effectively Christian. It didn't have to be this way, but these are the things we believe, and it's because Jesus Christ molded it for us.
And the elements that make up that water we swim in are good. They've been very good for us and very good for humanity, and they have not been the given way or the norm for most of humankind.
And in many parts of the world today, they're not the norm. And I think Tom Holland recognizes that these are unusual fruits cultivated in unique soil, the Christian story. There are other worldviews out there. There is Islam, there is China, there are other world powers where they have a different story of reality. And his worry, and I think others, is that if we lose the Christian story, how do we know that those fruits will remain? And how do we know that we will be able to continue the expansion of this idea, this vision of the West, given the fact that there are many other stories in our world that are now increasingly growing in power?
Right. And what fills the void if Christianity is, or as a worldview, or the story that we agree on, if that is eradicated, what fills the void?
Exactly.
And what does life look like if what fills the void is everybody gets their own story? And, you know, that's obviously going to lend itself to other things that are downstream from that unifying sort of story, that principle.
Absolutely. But Tom Holland is one among many interesting thinkers. I mean, someone I only mentioned briefly in the book, but I've since completing the manuscript had a chance to interview her a couple of times. I cheekily kind of almost referred to as the female Tom Holland. But Louise Perry is a fascinating thinker.
Yes.
And her particular concern has been in the area of sex and relationships. She grew up, I would say, with a kind of standard liberal Western view of feminism, but she kind of came to rethink it because she worked in a rape crisis center, and she saw that the way we think about sex in the West, the sexual revolution, just was not good for women. She wrote a whole book on this called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, written purely really from a kind of socio-evolutionary perspective, showing all the ways in which this kind of culture in which basically men, as far as she sees it, are allowed to sort of almost exist unbridled in terms of their sexual appetites. Sure. And women are kind of expected to become more like men in the way that they engage in relationships and so on. She said this has actually been a terrible thing for women when it just comes to biology, socio-evolutionary circumstances, and so on. And but I think in the course of writing that book, she kind of was surprised herself that she was effectively coming to very historic Orthodox Christian conclusions, because she said, well, it turns out by the final chapter, I'd realized that the best way of expressing relationships turned out to be monogamous, faithful relationships, marriage. And she said, she was essentially realized that Christianity, for all its faults, had actually got that right. It was the best of a lot of worst options, if you like. It wasn't perfect, but it seemed to make sense. And Louise Perry since has been effectively saying very similar things to Tom Holland. Look, folks, I know Christianity's unfashionable. This idea of keeping sex for marriage between one man and one woman is incredibly unfashionable in our culture right now. But it turns out it might be the best thing for people. And so when I see secular intellectuals like Tom Holland, like Louise Perry, coming up and saying these things, and not saying it because they have a Christian bias, they literally have just come to these conclusions, and it turns out they kind of match the Christian story. It makes me wonder whether something's changing in our culture, whether the stories that we're telling ourselves, whether it be the sexual liberation story or the you can make your own identity story. I think people like Holland and Louise Perry are showing us that those stories are failing. They're not delivering on what they promised. Yeah. And maybe once we get to the end of those stories, people are ready to hear again, as I believe Tom Holland and Louise Perry are, ready to hear the Christian story again.
So of these people that you're talking about, their stories are so fascinating. Have any of them actually become Christians themselves, or are they just sort of wanting to reclaim the form of, or what Christianity offers to society as a construct?
I think at the personal level, you would probably have to ask them where they're at. And I suspect, among all the people I profile in this book, they're all at different places. Some of them I think are holding Christianity at arm's length. Others I think are kind of tentatively stepping into and trying to embrace it as best they can. So I don't want to say exactly where either of those two people are on that spectrum, but absolutely, I think there is a sense that they value the Christian story. They see the way in which it has impacted and had a valuable sort of heritage in the West. But I think they're also aware that this story probably can't continue in that way unless people actually believe it. And I think they would like people to believe it, even if they sometimes have trouble believing it themselves. It's kind of a strange place to be in, but they can see the way that actually believing this story is true has transformed culture in the past.
Absolutely. I have a interesting sort of relationship intellectually with the work of Jordan Peterson. And I've seen how he has impacted, mostly positively, the lives of so many young men, including men in my congregation, including me. I mean, I've been positively impacted by his work in recent years, but his sort of tenor around Christianity, it sounds eerily similar to what you're describing, which is sort of a real friendliness about Christianity, but maybe wanting to stop short of going all in with Jesus and saying, let's evangelize now.
I think there is a sort of, I think especially for intellectuals, that there can be a sense of they don't want to surrender their brain. And I think that's often what they've been told culturally you are doing in becoming a Christian is you kind of have to surrender an intellectual part of yourself. Obviously, I don't believe that's true. I believe actually you can have the best of both worlds when
Yeah.
you're a Christian. But I have had, off mic conversations with some of these folk, and it's so interesting because many of them, they want it to be true and they want to be able to believe, but there is a bit of an intellectual kind of barrier there. They can see the value of it. They have friends very often who have converted to Christianity, but
Yeah.
there's something stopping them. And I don't know, that'll probably be each individual will have to work that out as to what that means for them.
Sure. What's Jordan Peterson's famous line when he's asked about God or about Christianity?
Well, when I asked him about this on my show, he said, it depends what you mean by God.
Yeah.
And then he said, I live my life as though God exists.
Right, that's the one.
And
yeah.
he said, as far as he's concerned, he says, what people say they believe is kind of to some extent irrelevant because in the end, it's actually how you act tells you what you actually believe. And I think there's something in that.
Pretty biblical, actually.
Faith without works is dead. It's that sense that, yes, you can say, I believe in God, but does your life look like you actually trust in God? I mean,
Right.
that's the real test. So I think there's something in that, and I understand him not wanting to be pinned down too much, because I think for all of these intellectual thinkers who are sort of somewhere on the outskirts of Christianity and kind of pointing people towards it, for me, there's actually, they're kind of serving a really useful function in a funny way as sort of prophets from outside the church, because often people are more willing to listen to them because they don't feel like they're invested or they're a salesman for this thing. And I think that's interesting that, for me, God is using people, unusual people, to kind of often doing a better job than we are inside the church
Right.
to kind of point people back to the Christian story.
Well, yeah, they're not investing in billboards or sides of buses, which there's another quote from your book. I can't remember who it was you quoted that said, anytime somebody pays for advertisements, they have a product.
Or a religion.
Or
to
a
sell.
religion, that's
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Who was that?
It
You
was
remember?
Margaret Atwood, I think.
Margaret Atwood, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
When I think about Jordan Peterson and people like him, I wish more Christians spoke as passionately about Jesus
Yes.
and the Bible as I see. Jordan Peterson can't talk about Jesus without crying.
Well, absolutely, and he's an interesting character in that respect, because I think because he went through this illness he had, where he was out of the public eye for a year and a half, and obviously had very near-death kind of encounter at that point. I think he came out of that, and I did notice a big change in the way he talked about faith from that point onwards. I noticed that his wife Tammy became a very committed Catholic.
Yeah.
His daughter Michaela, who I've also had a conversation with, has become a Christian. It feels like the net is closing in a way on Jordan Peterson, but he has this very quite close personal friendship with an Eastern Orthodox thinker, Jonathan Peugeot, and when I heard them in conversation talking about Jesus, Jordan Peterson got very emotional, describing almost in C.S. Lewis-like terms the way that he sees the character of Jesus bringing together the world of mythology and meaning that he's so invested in as a psychologist, and if you like, the world of material stuff and history. And he said in Jesus, you sort of have those two worlds collide. And he said, I can't understand my belief and I'm almost scared of it, something like that. He was very sort of personally affected by this idea. So who knows where that story will end. But it's interesting to see Jordan Peterson working his faith out in public in that way. And I think that in itself is giving other people, especially a lot of these young men who follow him, a kind of permission to take Christianity seriously.
Yeah.
Which they weren't given, quite the
right.
opposite under the new atheists.
That's right.
They would have been laughed out of court. But now it feels like, okay, this is an option.
Well, we have young men at our church that have come around again because of Jordan Peterson's teachings on Genesis and his lectures on the book of Genesis. And because it gave them a framework to make sense of Christianity again and to consider walking through that door again.
Yeah.
And so, I'm super grateful.
Yeah.
Obviously grateful for your work to that end as well. I think some might say that there's a risk involved in making it seem satisfactory from a Christian perspective to sort of revisit Christianity as a social construct.
Yeah, as a sort of psychologically useful fiction.
Utility,
almost. Yeah. I agree. And that for me is, it will always be too little and not enough if you stop at that point. I welcome the fact that people are going that far,
Absolutely.
if you like, at recognizing the value of Christianity. But for me, there's another thinker called Brett Weinstein who I've had conversations with, and he has this line that religion is metaphorically true, he says. So basically, it's true because it works, okay? But I think it's the other way around. I think the reason it works is because it's literally true, not just metaphorically true. I think you don't get the kinds of benefits we've had from the Christian Revolution without there being a real event that sparked that. For me, you'll only have the benefits of Christianity in the end if you come to it as a true story, as something that is capable of transforming people and transforming the world. So for me, I love the fact that these new thinkers are kind of opening the door, but I want people to go through the door and realize this is true. And for me, that's the other half of the book, is showing, here's why you would want it to be true. This is, people like Peterson and Holland and Louise Perry are kind of showing you why you would want this story to be true. Well, here's good news. It is true. Yeah. There's a real story here that you can invest your life in.
Basically, the second half of the book is just that beautiful invitation, so well articulated. And it felt to me like Justin Brierley, the interviewer, was becoming Justin Brierley, the evangelist.
Oh, well.
Is that what's happened?
I mean, even as an interviewer, being very kind of neutral moderator person, I'm still an evangelist at heart, Eric, because I actually believe that those conversations have an evangelistic potential. I hope the book does, because yes, I'm interested in the end in inviting people into, I think, the story that has changed the world and can still transform every individual. So I do include a number of people, not just who are kind of on the edges, but also secular thinkers who have gone all the way, become Christians. I mean, I've had the privilege of, again, interviewing a couple of times now Paul Kingsnorth, who's a celebrated author and poet from the UK. He's got a background in environmental activism, and he's just a fascinating individual because he has really been on a kind of religious search all his life. He started out as a sort of teenage atheist, I guess. He'd kind of had a nominal sort of experience of Anglicanism growing up in the UK, but it hadn't stuck. Yeah. And he's kind of sort of, a lot of people go through a teenage atheist phase. He had his, but he says he could never bring himself to believe the world was disenchanted. He loved being in nature. There was something about nature that spoke to him so deeply. And so he decided to maybe find something to believe in. He tried, first of all, Buddhism, and for many years, was on Buddhist retreats, meditation, Zen Buddhism, kind of trying to look inwards to find that meaning and purpose. But in the end, he said he felt like he wanted to worship something, and Buddhism didn't give him that option. And so, believe it or not, he went to Wicca. So essentially kind of a modern variation on witchcraft and New Age. And he calls it actually a Christian heresy in retrospect. He says it uses a lot of kind of quasi-Christian rituals and things, but you're doing it in the woods and chanting. And he said it was fun, but he ultimately found it didn't satisfy. And he said he was having dinner one night with his wife, and she'd quite out of the blue said, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "What are you talking about? Why would you say that?" It was not something he'd considered as a possibility. He was like, that was like, I remember what Christianity was. It's that irrelevant Sunday school thing from my past. Yeah. But she was right. And he suddenly started being contacted by all kinds of followers of his who turned out to be Christian leaders who wanted to send him their sermons. And he started having dreams about Jesus as well. And this was very significant. And all of this led to a moment where he felt like he was literally being chased down by God. And he finally gave in. He actually went into a part of the church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, lives in Northern Ireland and Ireland, and is part of the Romanian Orthodox Church. So it's an interesting, place he's found himself in the Christian church. But he has become a very staunch advocate for the need for Christianity in our world. He is an absolutely sold out Christian. And if it can happen to Paul Kingsnorth, I feel like it could happen to anyone. It's such an unusual story. And those are some of the surprising stories I'm coming across of people you wouldn't expect. These highly intelligent cultural influencers, but who are suddenly finding the Christian story make sense of their story in ways they hadn't expected. And I just wonder whether that might be the first signs that something's changed.
Yeah. So, that is the beauty of it all, is that what you're arguing for is all of the social ramifications of Christianity and the Christian worldview in the West, all the value that it brings, is even that is not the end in itself, but a means to a greater end of people, individuals, and communities like waking up to a personal sort of relationship with this God of whom we speak, and the God who makes all of this beauty possible, you know, and all this good stuff possible. And I hear that is sort of what's really behind what you're saying. I wonder, I mean, given obviously there's a reawakening in our culture now to spirituality. I mean, the number of atheists is not really going up. You know, there's increasing numbers of agnostics and a way increase in unaffiliated.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's not, as you say, if you actually look at the surveys, even though we're getting this big, obvious increase in non-religious, the nuns, the number who actually tick the kind of "I am an atheist" really hasn't changed much over the years, and so it is this kind of spiritual but not religious category that I think is actually growing.
And which no one would have expected 20 years ago, by the way. Like everyone thought that half the country would be atheist by 2030 or whatever. And we're just not going that direction for reasons you've articulated and you've written about in the book. How do we as Christians help people to see the uniqueness of Christianity compared with some of the New Age spirituality, and you know, because it's so appealing to people who are individualistic and maybe slightly.
Yeah, it is that thing I said earlier that you can't extinguish the religious impulse in people, and it's interesting to see that even in our highly scientific, you know, secular age, the numbers of calls the Catholic Church are getting for exorcism because people are dabbling in witchcraft, the occult, Ouija boards. I noticed on TikTok there's a new trend, witch talk, and these are people casting hexes and doing incantations and things, but using TikTok as the medium for it. So it's a strange world we live in where people can't quite leave behind the sort of that supernatural dimension of life. They want it. Yeah. You know, you see it, I think, in the continuing popularity of horror movies and even sort of superhero movies, Harry Potter. You know, we want life to kind of be enchanted. We want it's not to just be this material reality that we inhabit. Yeah. Now, the problem is that all of those stories, for me, they're pale imitations of the story, if you like. And I think sometimes the way I see it is we're living like Paul did when he was in Athens, in a very religious culture. He sees all the idols and he says to the thinkers, I see you are very religious. Well, let me tell you about the God you've been searching for. And he's not that far away from you, okay? You've been groping around in the dark, he says, but I want to tell you about the God that you've been searching for. And I think that's what we're here to do. We're here to say people, look, I understand where this comes from. I'm not going to dismiss your search for truth, for meaning. I'm not going to make fun of the fact that you have these religious inclinations, because they're there for a reason, because you're made to live in a story, but the story you're telling yourself isn't the big story. It's a kind of small version of it that's kind of gone off course. But the God, just as Paul said to the Athenians, you're looking for is not far away. And so it's about reminding people of the true and good story, of the God who actually is answering all those questions they're trying to answer in their life. That's going to look different for everybody, because we've all got our own abilities as to how we do that, how we show and tell that story, sing that beautiful melody in our own lives. But I ultimately believe that's the only story that will ultimately give people that satisfaction. We're trying to fill the God-shaped void with all these other stories, but there's only one story that ultimately does the job.
That's so good. And you know what you've taught me and so many others over the years is just the value of patience and refusing to close the door on somebody.
Absolutely.
We close doors inadvertently all the time. Christians close doors proverbially when we put politics, too high up on our totem pole of importance, or when we draw lines in the sand about certain, behaviors or whatever. I think we close doors when we just behave like jerks, and just do what Dawkins used to do to Christians, ridicule them, shame them or whatever. And you have always, for years now, left the door open and trusted God enough to see evangelism as a long game and a slow burn. And that, trust God that when he does decide to break through with somebody, that the door of your friendship with them, the door of your church, like that door will be open when the time comes.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. It's about keeping the conversation going. As soon as you've decided someone's a heretic, done what the culture sadly often does to people, you've cancelled them
That's
because
right.
you disagree with them, then you've kind of decided that redemption is impossible. And then you've basically said, God can't do what God wants. And I just refuse to believe that.
Yeah.
I see God working in the lives of so many people, whether they call themselves Christian or not. And if we call ourselves Christians, then we're called to trust that God is working in ways. And we just do what we can do faithfully. We pray, we trust, we open our lives and our hearts to people, help do what we can to show them that this is the true story they're looking for, and kind of trust that God will do the rest.
That's good. So I do want to encourage everybody again to check out this book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God by Justin Brierley. Well done. What else are you up to? What else is on your plate these days?
Well, I'm really enjoying the opportunity to pursue some new projects at the moment. So this new Re-enchanting podcast that we film in London, it's an amazing view over the London skyline with the Houses of Parliament in the background. We're talking to some fascinating people. We're just about to launch season 2 of that. So if you enjoy podcasts, Re-enchanting is what you're looking for. And I'm really excited to be telling this story in long form as well of the surprising rebirth of belief in God through a podcast documentary series. So that will either be out or just about to release at the time this show goes live. So
Great.
You're looking for the surprising rebirth of belief in God, and everything's available from the website justinbrierley.com.
Okay, and the podcast documentary series by the same name.
Yeah, the same name.
Will be obviously on your website, but can they find that on Apple Podcasts?
Yeah,
or
it'll be wherever you get your podcast from.
Great. Well, I think Justin Brierley deserves an invitation to the Joe Rogan podcast. So, Joe, if you're listening, so many of your guests have ended up there eventually.
Well, it's interesting. He's a case in point where I've seen even in Joe Rogan's podcast this just an inkling that the God question is coming through more and more frequently. So
it's a very different conversation about God now than there was 10 years ago.
It is. It's another good example. But yeah, Joe, if you're listening, always happy to come over to Austin, Texas and do one there
just
too.
a few miles down the road from here. Justin Brierley, thank you so much for being here today. You're really a blessing.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We hope to have you back.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.